Title: We're not paying for him, my DIL told the waiter. When the bill came, the manager walked over and handed me a golden envelope. The sound of shattering crystal cut through the low hum of the upscale restaurant. My husband, Arthur, froze. His hand, still trembling slightly from the lingering effects of his stroke, hovered over the table. Ice water dripped from the edge of the linen tablecloth onto the polished hardwood floor. He looked down, his cheeks flushing with immediate embarrassment. I'm sorry, he mumbled, his speech just a fraction slower than it used to be. Before I could reach for a napkin to help him, my daughter-in-law's voice sliced through the air. Oh, for heaven's sake. Chloe sighed loudly, rolling her eyes. She practically threw her silk napkin onto her plate. She looked up at the young waiter who was rushing over with a towel. Don't bother setting another glass for him. He's done. She then pointed a manicured finger at Arthur and looked directly at the waiter. Actually, we're not paying for him. Split the check. My husband and I aren't subsidizing this mess. I felt the air leave my lungs, not from sadness, but from a sudden, ice-cold clarity. I looked across the table at my son, David. He was 35, wearing a $3,000 suit I had helped pay for, swirling his scotch. Chloe is right, Mom, David said, not even looking at his father. It's getting exhausting to take him out in public. You really need to consider full-time care. He's a burden. To you and to my image. A burden. The man who had worked 60-hour weeks as an architect to put David through an Ivy League college was now a burden. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. 35 years as a senior certified public accountant taught me that emotions make you sloppy. Data, leverage, and timing. That is how you win. I gently placed my hand over Arthur's trembling fingers and squeezed them reassuringly. Then I looked at the waiter, whose eyes were wide with uncomfortable shock. There will be no need to split the check, I said, my voice dangerously calm, before David or Chloe could smirk. The maitre d', the general manager of the entire restaurant, parted through the waitstaff. He bypassed my son entirely. He didn't carry a leather billfold. Instead, he carried a heavy gold foil envelope. He bowed his head respectfully and handed it directly to me. As requested, Mrs. Hayes. Directly from the management office upstairs. Thank you, Julian, I said, taking the envelope. David frowned, his arrogant posture faltering for a second. What is that? Mom, I told you I was treating tonight. Well, for you and me, anyway. Oh, I know you like to play the big shot, David, I replied, sliding my manicured fingernail under the flap of the envelope. But you see, to play the big shot, you actually need to have money. I pulled out the crisp, legally bound document and laid it on the table, right over the spilled water. This isn't a dinner bill, I said, looking right into my son's confused eyes. It's a 30-day eviction notice for your company's headquarters upstairs, along with a freeze on your corporate credit accounts. Chloe scoffed, crossing her arms. What are you talking about? You can't evict us. David's landlord is the Sterling Plaza Group. I smiled, a slow, predatory smile that made my son physically recoil. You think you own this table, David, I whispered. But you clearly didn't do your due diligence. I am the Sterling Plaza Group. I own this building. And as of tonight, you are out. To understand how a son could look his father in the eye and treat him like a piece of broken furniture, we have to go back 4 months. 6 months ago, Arthur suffered a mild ischemic stroke. He survived, thank God, but it aged him overnight. My strong, vibrant husband now relied on a silver-handled cane, and on bad days, a wheelchair. His mind was still sharp, but his body betrayed him. At first, David and Chloe played the role of the doting children. They brought flowers. They made sympathetic faces. But after a month, the visits changed. They weren't coming to check on Arthur. They were coming to take inventory. We live at the Cove, a sprawling, multi-million-dollar coastal estate Arthur designed himself. It sits in a protective family trust. I started noticing small things. Chloe asking how much the property taxes were. David pacing off the square footage of the backyard when he thought I wasn't looking. But the real red flag came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in my home office. As a retired CPA, I still managed all our finances with military precision. I went into our floor safe to retrieve our quarterly tax documents. I know my safe. I know exactly how my folders are arranged. Someone had been in it. The blue folder containing Arthur's medical life insurance and our trust deeds had been moved from the back to the front. 2 pages of recent bank statements were missing. I didn't say a word to Arthur. His blood pressure needed to stay low. Instead, I quietly went out to the living room where David was visiting his father. David was in the kitchen, taking a phone call, sounding frantic. "I need more time. The liquidity is tied up. Just give me 30 days. He hissed into the receiver. His leather briefcase was left open on the sofa. Now, a good mother respects her child's privacy. But a smart auditor knows when a ledger doesn't balance. I walked over, pretending to tidy up the coffee table, and glanced down into the open briefcase. Sitting right on top was a thick legal document. The bold heading at the top made my blood run cold. Durable power of attorney and transfer of trust conservatorsh. I squinted to read the subtext. It listed David as the sole controller of the Hayes family trust. The justification listed below it was sickening. Due to the physical and cognitive decline of Arthur Hayes and the advanced age and mental fatigue of Martha Hayes, he was trying to declare us incompetent. He wanted to take the house. Just then, I heard David's footsteps coming back from the kitchen. I quickly stepped away from the briefcase, my heart pounding against my ribs. That night, after I tucked Arthur into bed and made sure he was sleeping soundly, I walked into my office and locked the door. I poured myself a glass of bourbon, sat down at my mahogany desk, and woke up the monitors. I wasn't an old, fatigued woman. I was a veteran forensic accountant, and my son had just picked a fight with the wrong woman. I spent the next 4 hours doing what I do best, following the money. If David was desperate enough to try and steal his childhood home, it meant he was drowning. I logged into our secure offshore and domestic accounts. I cross-referenced the initial startup capital we had loaned David 5 years ago for his commercial real estate firm. The picture painted by the numbers was a disaster. David was horribly over-leveraged. He had taken out 3 massive loans on properties that were currently sitting empty. His cash flow was dead. He was exactly 3 months away from total bankruptcy. He didn't just want to manage the cove. He needed to sell it to bail himself out at 9 p.m. I picked up a burner phone I kept for emergencies and called a private investigator I used to use during messy corporate audits. "Frank," I said when he answered, "I need a full sweep on David Hayes. Personal, professional, offshore, everything. Priority 1. It's your own son, Martha." "You sure?" Frank asked, his gravelly voice thick with surprise. "If a wolf wears my son's clothing, Frank, I still shoot the wolf. Just get it done." I hung up. I sat in the glow of the computer screens, feeling a profound, hollow grief. My only child was plotting my ruin. I allowed myself exactly 1 minute to cry. 60 seconds of tears for the boy I used to hold. When the minute was up, I wiped my face. The mother was gone. The auditor was awake. I was just finishing printing the preliminary financial reports when the grandfather clock in the hallway struck 11 p.m. Suddenly, there was a sharp knock at the heavy oak front door. I frowned. It was pouring rain outside. Who would come to the estate this close to midnight? I checked the security camera feed on my iPad. Standing on my front porch, soaking wet and holding a thick manila folder, was Marcus Sterling. Marcus was David's business partner and lead corporate attorney. If David was the architect of this betrayal, Marcus was the one drafting the blueprints. I grabbed my pepper spray from the desk drawer, walked to the front door, and opened it just a crack, keeping the security chain attached. "What do you want, Marcus?" I asked sharply. "It's late." Marcus looked around nervously, wiping rain from his face. He held up the manila folder. "Mrs. Hayes," Marcus whispered, his voice trembling slightly, "please let me in. We need to talk about your son, before he destroys both of you." I stared at Marcus through the narrow gap in the door, the heavy brass security chain still engaged. Rain lashed against his trench coat, slicking his dark hair to his forehead. "I have a loaded .38 caliber revolver in my desk drawer." "Marcus," I lied smoothly, "and an alarm system that will have the county sheriff here in 4 minutes. Why exactly should I let you in?" He didn't flinch. He just held the manila folder a little higher. "Because the papers in this folder are going to put your son in a federal penitentiary, and I want to help you do it." I studied his face. I saw exhaustion, fear, and a strange, desperate resolve. I unlatched the chain and pulled the door open. 10 minutes later, Marcus was sitting in my leather guest chair, a mug of black coffee warming his hands. I sat behind my desk, flipping through the documents he had brought. They were drafts of the power of attorney and trust transfer. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, looking up. "You're David's lead counsel. You're his partner. If he goes down, your reputation takes a hit." Marcus stared into his coffee. 20 years ago, my father died of a heart attack. He was a framing contractor for Arthur's architecture firm. We were left with nothing. I was going to drop out of college. He looked up, meeting my eyes. Arthur paid my tuition. Anonymous checks every semester until I graduated law school. I only found out it was him 3 years ago. I felt a sudden tightness in my throat. That was so like Arthur, quietly generous, never seeking credit. "David doesn't know what kind of man his father is," Marcus continued, his voice hardening. "He sees Arthur's stroke as an opportunity. He wants me to finalize these documents to declare you both unfit, take control of the cove, and liquidate it to cover a $5 million hole in his company." "I know about the debt," I said calmly. "I audited his accounts tonight. But if I refuse to sign this, David will drag us to civil court. He'll tie up our assets for years." "Exactly," Marcus leaned forward, "which is why we don't fight him in civil court. We let him hang himself in federal court." I raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening. If you fight him, it's a family dispute," Marcus explained, his lawyer instincts taking over. "But if I alter the hidden clauses in this power of attorney, if I change it from a transfer of assets to a conditional trap, and he uses it to secure a bank loan, it becomes federal wire fraud and bank fraud." I finished for him, a slow realization dawning on me. "Yes," Marcus nodded. "But to make him believe he's won, you have to play the game, Martha. You can't be the sharp, terrifying woman you are. You have to be the tired, overwhelmed old lady he thinks you are. You have to surrender." Marcus reached into his pocket and placed a tiny black square on my desk. It was a voice-activated micro-recorder. "He's coming over for Sunday brunch," Marcus said softly. "Let him think you're breaking." Sunday morning arrived with brilliant sunshine, mocking the dark cloud hanging over my dining room. I had taped the micro-recorder under the edge of the mahogany table. I wore a faded cardigan I usually saved for gardening, left off my makeup, and let my shoulders slump. When I looked in the mirror, I saw the exhausted senior citizen my son wanted to see. David and Chloe arrived right at 10 a.m., carrying a box of expensive French pastries. They breezed in, smelling of designer perfume and fake concern. Arthur was seated in his armchair, reading the morning paper. His right hand shook slightly as he turned the pages. "Oh, Arthur, let me help you with that. You're just struggling so much." Chloe cooed in that disgustingly sweet, high-pitched voice people use for toddlers. She practically snatched the paper from him. Arthur blinked, looking humiliated. "I had it, Chloe. Thank you." I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted copper. "Play the game, Martha," I reminded myself. I shuffled over to the table, sighing heavily as I sat down. "I'm just so tired these days," I murmured, rubbing my temples. David's eyes lit up with predatory excitement. He quickly set his leather briefcase on the table and pulled out the thick stack of papers. "Mom, I've been thinking," David said, using his best empathetic voice. "You're taking on too much. Dad's condition is deteriorating. You shouldn't have to worry about the trust or the estate or the bills. I had Marcus draft up some temporary management papers, just to take the burden off you." He slid the papers toward me. The trap was set. "Oh, David, I don't know." I wavered, making my voice shake perfectly. "Giving up control of the trust, it's everything your father built. It's just administrative, Martha." Chloe chimed in, sipping her mimosa. "Honestly, you look exhausted. You need to focus on nursing Arthur. Leave the big decisions to the men." The sheer misogyny almost made me break character. "Almost. I need time," I whispered, pushing the papers back slightly. "Just a few days. Let me read it over." David looked annoyed but masked it quickly. "Of course, Mom. Take a few days. But don't wait too long. For Dad's sake." They didn't stay long after that. As they were walking toward the front door, Chloe paused by the massive bay window, looking out over the sprawling estate. "It really is a beautiful property," Chloe mused. Then, she casually adjusted her diamond earring. "It's a shame the structural engineers, said the East Wing guest house needs a complete gut job before the corporate buyers will sign off. David shot her a sharp, panicked look and nudged her arm. Chloe, we have to go. They hurried out the door. I stood completely still in the hallway. The house was dead quiet. Structural engineers? Corporate buyers? My property is 60 acres. The East Wing guest house is nearly half a mile down a private, wooded road from the main house. I hadn't authorized any engineers on this property. The tired old woman act vanished. I marched to the hall closet and grabbed my boots. The morning dew was still heavy on the grass as I drove my golf cart down the winding, tree-lined path toward the East Wing. The guest house was a beautiful, two-story cedar structure overlooking the private beach. Arthur had designed it as a retreat for our extended family. As I rounded the final bend, my stomach dropped. There were 2 white commercial vans parked on the grass. Men in hard hats were carrying surveying equipment and tripods around the foundation. Anger, hot and sharp, flared in my chest. I stopped the cart, stepped out, and walked directly toward a man holding a clipboard and a rolled-up set of blueprints. "Excuse me," I said, my voice cracking like a whip in the quiet morning air. "Who is in charge here?" The man turned, looking me up and down. I'm the foreman for Vanguard Construction. We're doing the structural viability report. Can I help you, ma'am? This is private property." "I am acutely aware that it is private property," I snapped. "I am Martha Hayes. My husband and I own this estate, and I want you off my land right now." The foreman frowned, looking confused. He tapped his clipboard. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I was hired by the owner, David Hayes. I have the signed pre-sale agreement and the land survey permits right here. We've been authorized to prepare the site for demolition." Demolition. The word hit me like a physical blow. David wasn't just selling Arthur's legacy. He was letting them tear it down to build whatever monstrosity his buyers wanted. "Show me," I demanded, holding out my hand. "Show me the authorization." He hesitated, but the absolute authority in my tone made him hand over the clipboard. I flipped past the work orders to the legal authorization page. There, at the bottom of the document, was a signature authorizing full site access and pre-sale preparations to David's company. It was signed Arthur Hayes. I stared at the ink. For the last 6 months, ever since the stroke, Arthur's signature had been a jagged, shaky scrawl. It took him 30 seconds just to sign a grocery receipt. The signature on this document was smooth, fluid, and perfect. It was a flawless replica of Arthur's signature from a year ago. My son hadn't just tried to manipulate me. He had forged his disabled father's signature on a legal real estate document. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" the foreman asked nervously. "No," I said quietly, handing the clipboard back. "There is no problem. Please pack up your equipment. You'll be receiving a call from your employer shortly." I walked back to the golf cart, my hands trembling, not from age, but from absolute rage. This was no longer a family disagreement. This was a felony. David had crossed a line from which there was no return. I pulled out my burner phone and dialed Frank, my private investigator. "Frank," I said as soon as he answered. "David forged Arthur's signature on a pre-sale agreement. He's desperate for cash. I need to know where the money he's bleeding out of his company is actually going. Find his offshore accounts." "I'm already on it, Martha," Frank replied, his voice grim. "But you might want to sit down for this. I found a shell company in the Cayman Islands. But the name on the account, it isn't David's." I sat in my golf cart, the engine idling, staring blankly at the windshield. "Repeat that, Frank," I said into the burner phone, my voice dropping an octave. "The shell company in the Caymans," Frank said, the rustle of papers audible over the line. "It's registered under the name Coral Horizon Holdings. Over the last 4 months, nearly $1 million has been bled out of David's commercial accounts and wired there. David thinks he's paying off obscure consulting fees to keep his creditors at bay. But he's not. Who is the registered agent for Coral Horizon?" I asked, though a cold, sickening suspicion was already wrapping around my chest. "A man named Thomas Vance," Frank replied. I closed my eyes. Thomas Vance, Chloe's older brother. "I've got more," Frank continued, not letting me process the blow. "Thomas Vance is a mid-level accountant. He doesn't have the brains to set up an offshore tax haven. But Chloe does. I ran a deep dive on her personal communications. She's been making weekly trips to a private safety deposit box downtown, and she's not going alone. My knuckles turned white against the steering wheel. Who is she with? His name is Julian Pierce, a real estate broker for the very firm David owes money to. From the surveillance photos, they look very cooperative. Let's just say they aren't discussing interest rates in the back of his Mercedes. I ended the call, the silence of the morning suddenly deafening. I had spent the last 2 days believing my son was a monster. Now, I realized he was also a fool. David was forging his disabled father's signature, risking federal prison and alienating his own parents, all to steal our estate and save his company. Meanwhile, his wife was quietly draining what little cash he had left, funneling it offshore, and preparing to disappear with her lover, the moment David secured the money from the sale of the Cove. A twisted part of me wanted to march into David's office, slap him across the face, and show him the evidence. I wanted to shake him and scream, "Look at what she is doing to you." But 35 years of auditing taught me a brutal truth. If you warn a drowning man who doesn't realize he's sinking, he will just pull you under with him. David wouldn't believe me. He would think it was a trick to stop him from taking the trust. No. If he wanted to play a high-stakes game of deception, I would let him play it all the way to the end. But I was going to deal the final hand. I started the golf cart and headed back to the main house. I had a phone call to make to Marcus. It was time to rewrite that power of attorney. 2 days later, the stress finally broke Arthur's fragile equilibrium. I woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of shallow, ragged breathing. Arthur was pale, sweating profusely, his blood pressure dropping dangerously low. The panic that seized me wasn't calculated or logical. It was the raw, terrifying fear of a wife losing the man she had loved for 40 years. The ambulance ride was a blur. By 6 a.m., Arthur was stabilized in a private room at Mercy General, hooked up to an IV, resting under the watchful eye of a cardiologist. I was sitting in the hard plastic chair in the hallway, clutching a cold cup of vending machine coffee, exhausted and vulnerable. That was exactly the moment they chose to strike. The elevator doors chimed, and David and Chloe stepped out. David wasn't carrying a bouquet of flowers or a coffee for me. He was carrying his leather briefcase. Chloe walked a step behind him, her face arranged in an expression of tragic concern that didn't reach her cold eyes. "Mom," David said, rushing over. "How is he? Stable?" I whispered, my voice genuinely hoarse. "They say it was a transient ischemic attack, a warning sign. He needs absolute rest." "Oh, Martha, you poor thing," Chloe sighed, placing a hand on my shoulder. I had to physically restrain myself from flinching at her touch, knowing exactly whose bed she had been in the night before. "You can't keep doing this. It's destroying you." David unlatched his briefcase. Right there, in the sterile hospital hallway, while his father lay hooked up to a heart monitor 20 feet away, he pulled out the stack of legal papers. "Mom, I know this is terrible timing," David said, using a soft, persuasive tone. "But the hospital administration is going to need financial authorizations. The insurance copays alone are going to be massive. You need to sign these trust transfer papers. Let me handle the burden. Let me take care of you and Dad." I stared at the thick document. I recognized the subtle blue binding. It was the revised version Marcus had secretly printed for me the day before. Inside this document, buried on page 14, was a clause Marcus had expertly disguised in dense legalese. It stated that by accepting the power of attorney, David was simultaneously consenting to a full, unconditional federal audit of all his business assets by the IRS, and authorizing the release of all financial records to the authorities if fraud was detected. If David had read it, he would know it was a death warrant. But he wouldn't read it. He was too greedy. I looked up at my son. "David, please." "Not now. I just want to sit with your father." "Mom, you have to sign it." David's voice hardened slightly, the mask slipping. "If you don't, I can't pay his medical bills from the trust. Do you want him to suffer because of your stubbornness?" He handed me a silver pen. I let my hand shake. I let a single tear roll down my cheek. I took the pen, placed the document against the hallway wall, and signed my name on the dotted line. David practically snatched the paper from the wall. A huge, triumphant smile broke across his face. He looked at Chloe, and she smirked back. "You did the right thing, Mom. David said, closing his briefcase. He leaned in and kissed my cheek. "It's time you got some rest." He turned and walked away down the hall, his footsteps echoing with the confidence of a man who believed he had just conquered the world. He didn't see the tear on my cheek dry instantly. He didn't see my posture straighten. The trap had sprung. The rat was in the cage. Over the next 2 weeks, Arthur recovered beautifully. Once he was safely back at the cove, sitting in his favorite armchair watching the ocean, I told him everything. I told him about David's debt. I told him about the forged signature on the demolition order. I told him about Chloe's offshore betrayal. I expected Arthur to be devastated. I expected it to trigger another spike in his blood pressure. Instead, my quiet, gentle husband listened intently, resting his hands on his silver cane. When I finished, a profound sadness settled in his eyes, followed by a steely resolve I hadn't seen since his days running an architecture firm of 200 people. "He's not a boy anymore, Martha," Arthur said softly, his speech slow but perfectly clear. "He is a man making his own choices, and he chose to destroy us. What is the next step?" "The next step," I said, pulling up my laptop, "is forcing him to use that fraudulent document." I logged into my encrypted management portal for the Sterling Plaza Group. David thought his landlord was a faceless corporate conglomerate in New York. He had no idea I had bought the building under an LLC 15 years ago as a retirement investment. I drafted a formal notice of immediate credit termination and default. David's company relies on a massive line of credit from his landlord, us, to keep his daily operations afloat, I explained to Arthur. I am cutting it off. When his accounts freeze tomorrow morning, he will panic. He will have no choice but to take that fake power of attorney to his bank and attempt to take out a multi-million-dollar mortgage against our house to save his company. Arthur nodded slowly. And when he hands that forged document to a federally insured bank, he commits federal bank fraud. I finished. 2 days later, the mail carrier delivered an elegant, gold-embossed envelope to our mailbox. It was an invitation. David was hosting a lavish dinner party at the upscale restaurant located on the ground floor of the Sterling Plaza. The invitation read, "To celebrate the restructuring of Hayes Commercial Real Estate and the exciting future of our family legacy." He had taken the bait. He had submitted the papers to the bank, and he assumed the loan was going to clear on Monday. He was throwing a party to publicly announce that he was now the sole controller of the Hayes Family Trust, effectively humiliating Arthur and me in front of all his investors and peers. "He expects us to sit there and applaud while he steals our home," Arthur said, looking at the invitation. I walked over, placed my hand on his shoulder, and smiled. "Let him have his party, Arthur," I said, pulling a yellow legal pad and a stack of financial dossiers from my desk. "But we are bringing the entertainment." The private dining room at the back of the restaurant was a masterclass in opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over a long mahogany table set for 20 guests. David's top investors, a few key real estate partners, and the senior loan officer from his bank were all seated, sipping vintage champagne. Arthur and I sat at the far end of the table. We had just experienced the ugly scene in the main dining area. The spilled water, Chloe's cruel demand to split the check, and the delivery of my golden envelope. David was still reeling from my revelation that I owned the building, but his arrogance wouldn't let him retreat in front of his investors. He had quickly masked his shock, forcing a laugh and ushering everyone into the private room. He thought the eviction notice was my only play. He thought he still had the bank loan. He thought he still had the trust. He was about to learn that the eviction was just the appetizer. David stood up at the head of the table, tapping his silver spoon against his crystal flute. The room fell silent. "Thank you all for being here tonight," David began, flashing his million-dollar smile. He pointedly avoided looking at his father. "Tonight is about transitions. My company has reached a critical juncture, and to move forward, we must let go of the past." He placed his hands on the table, leaning forward confidently. "I am thrilled to announce that, as of yesterday afternoon, I have officially taken over full conservatorship of the Hayes Family Trust. With this massive injection of collateral, our new commercial development projects are fully funded." A polite round of applause rippled through the room. Chloe beamed beside him, playing the role of the proud, supportive wife to perfection. Arthur reached under the table and gently squeezed my hand. His grip was warm and steady. Now his eyes seemed to say. I slowly stood up. I didn't tap a glass. I didn't smile. I just projected my voice with the cold, resonant authority of a woman who had spent decades commanding boardrooms. A beautiful speech, David, I said, the sound cutting through the applause and silencing the room instantly. But there is a fatal flaw in your presentation. You see, I think you forgot to read the fine print of what I signed. David's smile tightened into a glare. Mom, please, don't make a scene. Your cognitive fatigue is showing. Sit down. Oh, I am wide awake, sweetheart, I replied, picking up a sleek leather folio from the floor beside my chair. And so is your attorney. The heavy oak doors of the private dining room swung open. Marcus Sterling walked in, carrying a thick stack of manila folders. David looked relieved for a fraction of a second. Marcus, perfect timing, please. Explain to my mother that the trust transfer is ironclad and filed with the state. Marcus didn't walk over to David. He walked the length of the table, stood directly behind my right shoulder, and placed the folders on the table. I can't do that, David, Marcus said, his voice echoing in the dead silent room. Because the document you submitted to the bank yesterday wasn't a transfer of the Hayes family trust. It was a trap. David's face went completely blank. What are you talking about? You drafted it. No, I corrected him, opening my leather folio. Marcus drafted what you asked for. But before I signed it in that hospital hallway, Marcus and I made a few strategic revisions. Clause 4, subsection B. Marcus began walking around the table, handing a copy of the actual document to every investor, stopping finally at Richard Gable, the senior loan officer from David's bank. By submitting that document to a federally insured financial institution, Marcus announced clearly, David legally consented to a full, unconditional IRS audit of all his personal and commercial holdings. Furthermore, the document acted as a sworn affidavit authorizing the immediate release of his financial records to federal authorities upon suspicion of fraud. David's face turned the color of ash. He gripped the edge of the table. Fraud? What fraud? Mr. Gable, the bank officer, quickly scanned the paper in front of him. He looked up, his face flushed with professional outrage. He stood up, tossing his napkin onto his plate. The fraud of a forged signature, David, Gable barked. Mrs. Hayes contacted my office this morning. The signature of Arthur Hayes on the property appraisal and the demolition permits you used to secure the collateral for our loan, they were forged. Verified by an independent handwriting expert. Gasps erupted around the table. Investors started whispering frantically. The loan is canceled, David, Gable said coldly, and my bank's legal team has already forwarded your file to the FBI. David staggered back a step, looking like a man who had just been shot. His empire was disintegrating in real time. He looked wildly around the room, finding no sympathy until his eyes landed on his wife. Chloe, David choked out, panic dripping from his voice. Chloe, it's okay. It's okay. We still have the Cayman accounts. We can hire a defense team. We can restructure the holding company. I looked at Arthur, and for the first time tonight, I smiled. Oh, David, I sighed, a chilling sound in the quiet room. You really are terrible at auditing. Chloe's face had drained of all color. She shrank back in her chair as David reached out to grab her hand. Mom, shut up, David yelled, completely losing his polished facade. You took the trust, fine. But my company has offshore reserves. We're going to fight this. You don't have reserves, David, I said calmly. I pressed a button on a small remote in my hand. The large flat-screen TV on the wall, meant for corporate presentations, flared to life. On the screen was a high-resolution photograph of Chloe passionately kissing a man in the front seat of a silver Mercedes. David froze. The breath rushed out of his lungs. Julian, he whispered, recognizing the man as one of his own real estate brokers. I pressed the button again. The screen shifted to a series of bank statements from Coral Horizon Holdings in the Cayman Islands. For the last 4 months, while you were desperately forging your disabled father's signature to steal the home he built, I explained, my voice echoing with righteous fury, your lovely wife was systematically draining your company's remaining cash. Nearly $1 million funneled into a shell company registered to her brother, Thomas Vance. Chloe leaped out of her chair crashing to the floor behind her. The sweet wife mask shattered, revealing the vicious, terrified animal underneath. "It's a lie," Chloe shrieked, pointing at me. "She manipulated the documents. She's trying to frame me." David slowly turned his head to look at her. The utter devastation in his eyes was almost pitiful. You were leaving me? You're a loser, David!" Chloe suddenly screamed, abandoning the lie. "You're drowning in debt. You couldn't even successfully steal from two old people. You think I'm going down with you? I earned that money for pretending to love you." She grabbed her designer purse from the table, practically shoving an investor out of the way as she bolted for the heavy oak double doors of the private room. "Stop her!" David yelled, lunging forward but tripping over his own chair. "Let her go," I said quietly. Chloe slammed the double doors open and sprinted out into the main lobby of the restaurant. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the lobby, the flashing red and blue lights of 3 police cruisers painted the dark street in frantic colors. 4 uniformed officers and 2 detectives in plain clothes were standing right inside the lobby doors, waiting. Chloe stopped dead in her tracks, clutching her purse to her chest as a detective stepped forward, holding up a pair of steel handcuffs. "Chloe Hayes," the detective said, his voice carrying clearly back into the dining room. "You're under arrest for grand larceny and wire fraud." Inside the dining room, David collapsed to his knees, burying his face in his hands, surrounded by the absolute ruin of his own making. The silence in the private dining room was deafening, broken only by the muffled sounds of Chloe crying and screaming at the detectives out in the lobby. One by one, David's investors silently stood up, buttoned their suit jackets, and walked out of the room without a backward glance. They were businessmen. They knew a sinking ship when they saw one. Mr. Gable, the bank officer, was the last to leave. He paused by David, who was still kneeling on the floor, and dropped the forged loan application next to him. 2 detectives walked through the oak doors. They didn't look angry, they just looked tired. "David Hayes," the lead detective asked, "we have a warrant for your arrest regarding federal bank fraud, wire fraud, and felony forgery." David scrambled backward, his expensive suit wrinkling against the carpet. He looked at the detectives, then up at me. The arrogant, self-proclaimed billionaire was gone. In his place was a terrified little boy looking for his mother to kiss his scraped knee. Mom, please," David begged, tears streaming down his face. He crawled toward me, his voice cracking. "Tell them it's a misunderstanding. Tell them it was a family dispute. You can fix this. You can pay the bank. I'm your son. I'm your only son." I looked down at him. My heart ached, a deep, maternal sorrow that I knew would never fully go away. But pity is not the same as forgiveness. Arthur placed his hand over mine, offering his silent strength. "I did fix this, David," I said gently, looking into his panicked eyes. "If I had let you use that fraudulent document, you would have stolen the home your father built with his bare hands. You would have put us in a nursing home to die while you lived off our blood and sweat." I took a breath, letting the icy steel of my voice return. "I saved you from becoming the man who destroyed his own father. But the money you stole from your partners, the lies you told the federal bank, you bought and paid for those consequences all by yourself." I nodded to the detectives. They stepped forward, hauled David to his feet, and clicked the heavy steel cuffs around his wrists. "I'm sorry, Dad," David sobbed, looking back over his shoulder as they marched him toward the door. "Dad, I'm sorry." Arthur looked at our son, his expression calm but infinitely sad. "I know you are, David," Arthur said softly, "but you're only sorry because you got caught." The doors closed, and the room was finally empty. The cleanup took exactly 1 month. David's commercial real estate company filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. His assets were seized, and the properties were auctioned off to pay his furious creditors. The legal battles were vicious, but not for us. We didn't have to lift a finger. David and Chloe turned on each other the moment they were placed in separate holding cells. Chloe's defense lawyer claimed David forced her to set up the offshore accounts. David's lawyer claimed Chloe orchestrated the entire fraud to fund her escape with her lover. They were locked in a cycle of mutually assured destruction, airing all their dirty laundry in federal court. It was tragic, pathetic, and exactly what they deserved. Marcus Sterling, true to his word, guided Arthur and me through the legal aftermath. With David's company dissolved, Marcus opened his own private practice. His first official act as an independent attorney was to become the exclusive legal counsel and executor for the Hayes Family Trust. I paid his retainer 3 years in advance. Loyalty is rare. When you find it, you reward it. One quiet Tuesday afternoon, Arthur and I were sitting in the library at the Cove. The fireplace was crackling, and rain was gently tapping against the windows. "It feels strange," Arthur murmured, looking out at the gray ocean. "The house is so quiet." "It's the quiet after a storm, my love," I replied, bringing him a cup of hot chamomile tea. "We had a cancer in our lives. It was painful to cut it out, and the scar will always be there. But if we hadn't done it, it would have killed us." Arthur took my hand and kissed my knuckles. "You are a terrifying woman, Martha Hayes. I am very glad you are on my side." I smiled, resting my head against his shoulder. Always. But there was still one minor piece of business left to conclude. The following week, I drove back to the Sterling Plaza. It was 6 months later, a bright, crisp spring morning. I sat at a corner table in the restaurant, sipping a perfectly made espresso. The place was closed to the public for the morning prep. Julian, the maitre d', who had handed me the golden envelope 6 months prior, walked over and took a seat across from me. "The new management company has finished the transition, Mrs. Hayes," Julian said, sliding a polished leather binder across the table. "The Sterling Plaza is officially running on autopilot. Your monthly dividends will be deposited automatically." "Thank you, Julian," I said, signing the final page. "And congratulations on your promotion to regional director. You handled that messy night 6 months ago with absolute discretion." Julian smiled warmly. "It is a pleasure working for someone who actually knows how to run a business, ma'am." I drove home along the coastal highway, rolling the windows down to let the ocean breeze fill the car. I didn't feel like a tired old woman. I felt lighter than I had in a decade. When I pulled through the wrought iron gates of the Cove, I saw something that made my heart swell. Arthur was out on the lawn. He wasn't in his wheelchair. He was walking, relying only slightly on his silver cane, his posture straight and proud. The physical therapy we could afford, now that our trust was secure, had worked wonders. He was pointing out property lines to a landscaper, planning a new garden for the East Wing. Our home was ours. Our legacy was protected. I parked the car and walked out onto the grass to join him. He wrapped his free arm around my waist, pulling me close as we looked out over the deep blue waters of the Pacific. People often make the mistake of thinking that age brings weakness. They see gray hair and wrinkles, and they assume we are obsolete. They think because we are quiet, we are no longer sharp. But what the younger generation often forgets is that we didn't survive this long by being fools. We built the world they are so desperate to take over. And while they are busy rushing, fueled by greed and ego, we have the one weapon they don't possess: patience. Blood does not give someone the right to disrespect you. Family is an action, not an entitlement. If someone tries to burn your house down, you don't hand them the matches just to keep the peace. You lock the doors, you check your receipts, and you let them burn in the fire of their own making. My name is Martha Hayes. I am 62 years old, a retired CPA, and a fiercely protective wife. And if there is one piece of advice I can leave you with, it's this: never ever underestimate a woman who knows exactly what she's worth and exactly where she keeps her paperwork.